The village had never felt colder, had never looked so hollow, as it did the moment they turned their backs on her. Belisara stood at the edge of the crumbling stone bridge, the faint light of dusk fading beyond the twisted silhouette of the forest. Behind her, a handful of villagers stood clustered, their faces masks of solemn cruelty, etched by years of whispered superstition and simmering fear. Their eyes were a mixture of pity, relief, and barely concealed contempt. She had been their sacrifice, their offering to the dark, a problem they wished to banish beneath the mortal city, where the shadow court's cold, unknowable walls awaited. Her raven-black hair, streaked faintly with silver-like veins of moonlight, caught in a midnight river, blew in a cold wind that felt more like a warning than a caress. She had lengthened the scarf wrapped tightly around her neck to hide the jagged scar tracing the line of her jaw, a souvenir from a skirmish long ago, a reminder of battles fought quietly and lost. Now, vulnerability weighed her down like this stretching night, yet her ash-grey eyes, deep and storm-tossed, refused to soften under the weight of betrayal. No one had spoken the words outright. There had been no need. The villagers had left only a single token, a bone dagger, carved with symbols older than any of them dared remember, pierced into her palm. It was enough. The message was clear. Take it beyond, and do not return. The descent into the underworld was colder than anything Belisara had ever known. The city beneath the streets was a labyrinth of shadows and stone, a world buried deep, but thriving in the silence of mortal forgetfulness. Her footsteps echoed hollow in the vast tunnels, mingling with the faint metallic drip of water, pooling in unseen recesses. The air was thick with dust and a faint, musky scent like iron and old leather. Every shadow seemed to pulse with whispered threats. This was no place for the living, least of all for a woman abandoned. Her fingers clenched around the bone dagger's handle like a lifeline. She moved with a wary grace, born from years of survival, slow, deliberate steps, weaving around broken pillars and rusted iron rails. She knew she was being hunted, or at the very least watched. Her village believed this sacrifice would placate the Alpha King's wrath, would quiet the beasts lurking beneath their feet, but it was a mistake, one they would all pay for. A low growl tore through the stillness, vibrating in the very air around her. Belisara froze, senses sharpening in an instant. Out of the gloom, shining eyes appeared, amber like molten gold, cold and fierce. Massive forms, lean and powerful, emerged, muscles rippling beneath midnight, fur streaked with silvery flecks that caught what little light remained. The Alpha King's wolves, her heart hammered against her ribs like a war drum. The wolves circled her silently, closing the distance until the space between hunter and prey vanished. But beneath the threat in their posture, their snarling acceptance was unmistakable. These creatures, terrifying in their presence, made no move to attack. Instead, one beast, larger and more formidable than the rest, stepped forward with a slow, deliberate grace. Belisara met its gaze, and in that moment felt a strange kinship, a wild, restless spirit, much like her own, trapped beneath a surface cold enough to freeze rivers. The Alpha King's beast was not an enemy. It was a guardian, or perhaps something more complicated. The tension hung thick in the air, crackling with unsaid rules and ancient pacts. The wolf's growls softened, becoming a rumble of warning that continued to circle but never closed. In that charged silence, Belisara realized something profound. She was no longer alone, nor utterly forsaken. The Alpha King's beast had claimed her first. The shift was inescapable. She rose, the bone dagger hidden beneath her cloak, the faint scar along her jaw burning with new purpose. Her lone footsteps resumed, but now flanked by a staggering presence that none of the shadows had dared to claim. The throne room was a cavernous space hewn from black obsidian and lit by flickering sconces that cast dancing shadows against the towering walls. Kaelin sat atop his throne, a figure carved of power and restraint, shrouded in a palpable aura that twisted the air like a taut wire ready to snap. His dark brown hair showed streaks of silver at the temples, salt and peppered with battles and burdens alike. Amber eyes, hard, molten, watched her entrance with a wary fire. The jagged scar cut through his left brow like the mark of a tempest survived and tamed, a silent testament to the unforgiving world he ruled. Felisara's breath caught as every instinct in her screamed warning. The beast that had approached her in the tunnels thinned into its human guise beside the throne, muscles still tight beneath the folds of shadow-darkened clothing. Low, resonant growls hummed beneath Kaelin's measured words, thick with unspoken danger that came from an ancient and terrible loyalty. "You're here," Kaelin said, voice low and rough like gravel sliding down a mountainside, as though acknowledging her existence was a statement of fact and war both. "They wanted you for sacrifice. But I do not kneel to fear." Felisara's gaze flickered across the scarred features, reading the quiet power coursing beneath the surface, a wariness now tinged with something new, challenge. This was the Alpha King who could have ended her here and now. Instead, he had refused. That refusal meant everything. "I didn't think you'd come," she murmured, voice steady despite the storm inside. Defiance, the only armor she had left, rose quietly between them. "Why spare me?" Kaelin's amber eyes darkened further. The beast growled again, low and protective. "Because my kingdom is not built on cowardice, loyalty, strength, and because the shadows you carry might be sharper than those I know." His words settled between them, thick with meaning Felisara barely dared unravel. The silence stretched, long and electric, with a weight neither dared break. Around them, the Alpha King's wolves shifted on their haunches, taut muscles coiled like springs, eyes glimmering with feral intelligence. "Guarded," Kaelin declared abruptly, his voice slicing through the stillness. "But spared." The words hit her like a cold rush, both promise and challenge. She was no longer a sacrifice, but she was still a prisoner, beneath the cold stone ceilings of his domain. Felisara swallowed, feeling the surge of something she hadn't expected, hope tangled with dread. The silent war between them began here, in the tentacles of fate and fire. She would survive. She would prove her worth. The Alpha King could keep his wolves close, but she would not be caged. A ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not so easy to break." Kaelin's gaze sharpened, the faintest approving glint flickering in the molten gold of his eyes. "Nor am I." And so they stood, two fierce worlds colliding in the shadowed heart of the court, the beginning of an unspoken war, a dance of power, desire, and survival, written in the language of silence and growls. Outside, the shadows stretched, thick and watchful, waiting for what came next. Felisara moved quietly through the dim corridors of the shadow court, her footsteps muted on the cold stone floors, slick with the faintest sheen of dampness. The great hall behind her hummed low with the restless murmurs of the pack, wolves restless in their concrete kingdom, eyes gleaming like stars living beneath the earth. The air was thick with scents of musk, smoke, and raw iron, a different kind of wilderness where survival was etched into every breath. She cradled her arms close, the ghost of a chill brushing over her skin despite the heat that always lingered in the throne's shadow. She had found it by accident at first, a small whine beneath the gnarled roots of a cavernous arch where the wolves gathered, their bodies pressed tight against one another, fur matted and eyes bright with wary life. The pup was no bigger than a clenched fist, its fur tangled and dull, one paw bent awkwardly at an unnatural angle. Belisara's heart stiffened in her chest, a sharp pang twisting the iron chain of her resolve. Careful, she lowered herself to the uneven floor, the rough stones biting into her knees, but she did not flinch. Her fingers brushed against the trembling body, slow and respectful, the way a healer might touch a dying ember to coax it alive again. The little wolf's eyes fluttered open for a split second, liquid orbs clouded with pain and distrust before it whimpered and tried to crawl away. Belisara's hand stayed steady, her voice soft and low, murmuring syllables that had no name but carried promise all the same. "You're not alone," she said, almost ashamed of the tremor in her own voice. "Not any more." Her hands moved with quiet precision, unwrapping shredded cloth from her own tattered sleeves to bind the pup's paw with gentleness that was almost alien in this harsh domain. There was no room for weakness in the courts, where strength was the currency of survival, but she had learned in her exile how to hide a different kind, to send one forged in quiet patience and wounds that refused to close. The pup's breathing grew steadier under her touch. Belisara let her fingers linger a moment longer, tracing the fragile bones beneath the scraggy fur, as if to memorize every heartbeat still pulsing beneath the fragile surface. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the arch, she heard the almost imperceptible shift of Kaelin's presence, a bronze shadow against the grim backdrop. He watched from a distance, his amber eyes glowing like molten gold in the dimness, the jagged scar across his brow, a map of battles fought in shadow and blood. He had never seen the beast soften like this, not fully, not until now. The wolves, fierce and unwieldy, sensed it too. Their growls softened into curious murmurs, stealthy glances exchanged among them like whispered omens of an uneasy peace settling over the court. Belisara felt the weight of those gazes, but did not flinch. Her strength lay not in the roar of dominance, but in this quiet rising, the slow unraveling of fear into trust, the fragile bloom of healing in a place where pain was law and mercy, a forgotten myth. She stayed by the pup's side, long after its breathing evened out, hands folded loosely in her lap, the shadows pressing close, but no longer cold. Her ash-grey eyes scanned the tight-knit circle of wolves, the pack that had once been her tormentors, now a canvas for something new, something brittle and raw, yet undeniably alive. Somewhere behind her, the wolf pups sniffed with tentative curiosity, gathering near the small sanctuary she had carved from the ruins. Others lingered in the shadows, silhouetted against the flicker of torchlight, like spectres waiting for a sign. And in the midst of it all, the Alpha King's gaze lingered longer than anyone dared, his silent approval a tide turning beneath the brittle surface of the court. Whispers soon began threading through the stone corridors like a gathering storm, quiet murmurs of strange power radiating from the exile who had once been broken, the sacrificial lamb who now held the hearts of wolves in the palm of her steady hands. The healer, they called her, an odd name for one so surrounded by peril, but fitting nonetheless. She mends what no blade could touch, the voices said, tinged with awe and wariness. Belisara did not seek these whispers. She barely heard them over the pounding in her chest. But they were there, marking her passage through this labyrinth of shadows, the delicate fractures between predator and prey beginning to blur, the hard edges of law and loyalty shifting in her wake. The court's long shadows stretched deeper the next day, and with them came quieter dangers. Belisara had barely settled into the cold stone refuge when the first bitter winds of dissent whispered between the walls. The murmurs did not come from the wolves. They were loyal in their silent, feral way, but from the deeper current lurking beneath the court, the rival faction, serpents coiled in the underbelly of power, their eyes sharp and calculating. Belisara felt the weight of their gaze like a blade pressed her throat as she moved through the council chambers, where the air was heavy with the scent of old blood and ambition. Their voices did not rise, but the threat was unmistakable. "She is a liability," one voice hissed, low and venomous, "a broken sacrifice. Her place is on the pyre, not the throne's footstool," another added. "The Alpha King's mercy will be the court's ruin." Belisara stood silent, her ash-grey eyes cold and unyielding. She had seen this before, the disdain, the darkness veiling their intent, but today she was no longer the broken shadow cast to the fire, she was the spark dancing beneath, ready to ignite. Without a word, she crossed to Kaelin's worn cloak, the heavy leather-bound garment laid out on a stone bench, cracked by time and battle. It was no regal tapestry, but it bore the marks of a king who had fought a dozen wars in silence and steel. Her fingers traced the threadbare edges, the frayed hem struggling against the pass. Belisara collected a tattered piece of cloth from her own sleeve, a small scrap of silver thread she had salvaged from her scant belongings, and began the meticulous work of cleaning and repairing the cloak. The court's voices did not falter. They watched, wary and biting in their silence. Her hands moved steadily, each stitch a declaration. She did not need their permission. She did not seek it. Healing was not a privilege granted by kings, but a strength carved from within. She stitched not just the fabric, but the unseen tear between herself and the court, amending as much of identity as of leather. Kaelin watched from the shadows as the first taut line of silver thread caught the torchlight, a glint like molten fire tracing a fragile promise. He could have forbidden her touch, sent her away like any other exile, but the truth was, written in every motion of her hands, she belonged here, not as a pawn, not as a prize, but as a force, a reckoning. When the cloak was whole again, she held it before her like a shield, the glint of that single repaired seam a silent herald of her claim. Without waiting for a word, she folded it with care and left it where only Kaelin would see, on his chair in the heart of the council chamber. Later, at the gathering of the pack's fiercest and most cunning, Kaelin draped the cloak around his broad shoulders. The worn leather wrapped him like armor and legacy, but the silver thread glimmered defiantly, an unspoken message more powerful than any decree. In that moment, the council fell silent. The rival factions' biting tongues found no purchase. The murmurs died beneath the weight of Kaelin's quiet authority, and the burning truth, woven by Belisara's hands, she was no longer the sacrificial lamb. She was part of the court's heart, stitched into its very fabric by strength, will, and a power that no shadow could swallow. Kaelin's eyes caught hers across the room-amber fire, meeting ash-grey steel with an intensity deeper than any words spoken. It was a promise and a warning both. She had found her place, but the war, for it had only just begun. And Belisara, heart pounding like a wild drum in a dark forest, knew she was ready for the court, for the beast, for the king, for herself. Belisara's muscles burned with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed, the rhythmic slap of her boots against the dirt, and the sharp crack of wooden training swords slicing through the air, weaving into the thrum of her heartbeat. She had never imagined she'd stand shoulder to shoulder with Kaelin's warriors, not just as another shadowed echo on the edge, but as an equal, a contender, someone whose very presence unspooled the long-held assumptions of the Shadow Court. The early dawn painted the training yard in muted shades of steel and ash, and, as the sun crept higher, so too did her determination, climbing like a fire coiled tight within her chest. She squared her shoulders, the repaired cloak, heavy yet comforting against her back, a symbol not just of survival but of allegiance. The leather beneath her fingers was smooth now, the silver thread shining like faint veins of light, coursing through dark stone, and with every parry and thrust, the fierce knowledge that she belonged here settled deeper into her bones. The warriors around her, seasoned, ruthless, sworn to Kaelin, watched with guarded eyes, perhaps surprised, perhaps skeptical, but none dared mock, not any more. Kaelin stood at the edge of the training ground, a silent sentinel framed by the ancient oaks that bordered the yard. His jagged scar and molten amber eyes caught the morning light with a glint that was at once fierce and unreadable. When Velisara glanced his way, she caught the slow, deliberate exhale of the breath he didn't openly take. It was as if the beast within him, wild, untamed, and bound by chains of kingly duty, leaned toward her, curious and resolute. She felt the beast's pulse beneath his skin before she saw it reflected in his gaze, calm, watchful, an unspoken loyalty that defied the king's armor of command. There was a tension there, a quiet war between the man Kaelin was and the beast he had never allowed himself to fully embrace. Velisara's heart fluttered with reluctant hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was a beginning. Wood clashed against wood, metal mimicked lightning strikes, and whispered curses fell as the warriors pushed her to her limits. Velisara's fists tingled with pain and delay, but beneath the ache, something deeper stirred, a latent power pulsing at the edges of her awareness. She could feel it in the sway of the sword, the crackling energy in the air, whenever her weapon sought his, even in the grit of dirt under her nails and the sharp tang of sweat in her nose. She dodged a strike aimed at her side, twisting with an ease that surprised even her own muscles. The air shimmered faintly where her hand had moved, a fleeting distortion like heat rising off the stones in midsummer noon. She caught her breath, blinking up at the sky, the scent of pine sharp and clean, and realized, with mounting certainty, that the whisper of magic inside her was awakening. "Again," Kaelin said, voice low, but carrying over the din. His eyes were not on her sword, but on her stance, on the subtle flicker of power she hadn't yet learned to tame. Concentrate. There was no impatience in the command, only the cold edge of expectation and a trace of something else, something carefully guarded, like a thread pulling at his restraint. Velisara's throat tightened. "I'm not ready." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, steady and grounding. "Ready comes only with action. You fight or you fall. This is not the court of shadows where fear keeps you hidden. Here, you either stand or you die." Her voice twisted tighter round the words than she wanted. "Then I choose to stand." The declaration surprised no one more than herself. In the silence that followed, something broke open between them, a fissure, not of words, but of understanding. Kaelin's beast exhaled in a slow, measured growl beneath the surface, the primal part of him acknowledging her without the armor of command. Velisara had never felt so raw, so exposed, yet so fiercely tethered to something larger than herself. Days folded into nights, and the training continued with relentless precision. In stolen moments between bouts, Kaelin's glare softened just enough for her to catch the flicker of admiration or, at least, the grudging respect of a king who had not yet learned how to love without fear. She discovered that beneath the rough edges of his dominion was a man struggling to claim his humanity as fiercely as his throne. In those brief silences, their gazes spoke of silent promises and fragile truce, a burgeoning allegiance that neither dared voice aloud. Velisara's hands trembled one evening as the twilight bled into night. the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lavender blooms carried by a cooling breeze. She stared down at the small wound blossoming fresh across her palm from a miscalculated strike, and yet, beneath the pain, there was exhilaration, the exquisite ache of growth. "I see it," Kaelin said finally, voice low like a rumble in the distance. "You're more than the whispers they carry about you. And you," she hesitated, lifting her eyes to meet his amber gaze, "you're more than the beast they fear." His jaw clenched, the faintest shadow flickering across his face before he turned away with a stiff nod. "Don't mistake my restraint for weakness," but Velisara saw it all. The unspoken surrender buried beneath the king's iron will. Something fierce and fragile was growing between them, stitched thread by thread in shared battles and quiet glances. ****. The night was suffocating when the first sounds of the attack shattered the brittle peace of the court. A surge of shadows burst across the city's outer walls, twisting cold steel and whispered chaos into the dark. Velisara's heart pounded like a war drum, fierce and unforgiving as she found herself thrown unprepared into the maelstrom of violence. Kaelin was at her side before she could even draw breath, his presence a solid wall against the fraying edges of desperation. The sharp scent of leather and blood mingled with damp stone as they ran, running not toward safety, but deeper into the labyrinth of old catacombs buried beneath the city. The crypt had long been abandoned, forgotten beneath layers of dust and sorrow, but it was the only place they could hold. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind them, drowning the rioters' screams in a cavernous echo that hammered against Velisara's ribs. The darkness pressed inward, thick like velvet, over her skin. But this time the shadow did not suffocate. Instead, it wreathed her in a familiar embrace. Kaelin's beast stirred beside her like a tempest barely chained, muscles taut beneath his skin, amber eyes glowing fiercely in the dim firelight of torches slashed against the crypt's walls. The king's usual measured control fractured in the wildness of those moments, his leash slipping against the raw feral need to protect. "Velisara," his voice was sharp, edged with panic he did not let show. "Stay close. Don't let them see the fear. We can't survive if we're divided." She swallowed thick, her fingers curling into fists as the cold seeped into her bones, not just the chill of stone and shadow, but the sharp bite of the unknown. The dormant power humming beneath her skin flared to life like a ribbon of ice and fire, rising from the depths of her fear. She could feel it crackling up her spine, threading through her veins like a current. The walls whispered secrets, long-forgotten chants threading through the stillness, secrets she had hidden even from herself. Now, those whispers became a storm, tearing at the fabric of the dark around them. Her breath caught as the air thickened with raw energy, translucent waves of silver light pulsing from her outstretched hands, illuminating the cavern in a spectral glow. Kaelin's eyes widened, the beast beneath his skin growling low, a warning and a promise intertwined. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping forward as the shadows writhed, retreating from the glow she cast. "It's me," Velisara breathed, her voice trembling with power and disbelief. The cruel clang of steel against stone, shattering the fragile silence. The enemy closed in, voices jagged with rage, and Velisara's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged beast desperate for escape. Kaelin slid his arm around her shoulders, a grip both fierce and protective, his fingers digging into the tendons beneath her skin. "We fight as one," he promised, voice a thread of steel tight with emotion. "Trust the beast. Trust me." Together they stood, her light blaring defiantly amid the suffocating darkness, his presence towering and unyielding as the hallowed stone around them. And as the first wave of attackers surged into the crypt, the fragile lines between protector and protected blurred like smoke in the firelight. The beast within Kaelin roared to life, a primal fury unleashed, while Velisara's newfound power surged free, a dance of shadows and flame, whispered strength and raw force. Side by side, they became an unbreakable force. The Alpha King and the woman who had once been a sacrificial offering, now bound by blood, shadow, and something infinitely more potent. In that stifling crypt beneath the city on the edge of ruin, the war they had both fought alone was suddenly theirs to bear together. And Velisara felt it burn, a fierce, unrelenting certainty that whatever darkness came next, it would find them united, unyielding, and unafraid. Velisara awoke with a start, the remnants of a nightmare clutching at her chest like icy fingers. Sweat dampened her brow, and the moonlight filtering in through the narrow slit of the chamber window cast elongated shadows that whispered of things better left unspoken. Her breaths came ragged, uneven, as if the dream had sucked life from her lungs, draining hope in the process. The images pressed on her mind's eye, a cruel sequence of deceit and betrayal, faces veiled behind smiles that twisted into grotesque masks of treachery. The voices hissing, accusing reverberated, louder than the pounding of her heart. The echo of their lies clawed through the depths of her memories, surfacing things she had tried so desperately to bury. She sat up slowly, careful to move, without disturbing the quiet that cloaked the chamber like a fragile shield. The scar across her jaw itched beneath the moon's silver fingers, the familiar sting again reminding her why she had been cast out, why the shadow court had closed its bitter gates on her as if she were a ghost better forgotten. Not a prisoner, no, something far worse, an offering meant for sacrifice, a pawn tossed into the jaws of darkness to appease powers more cruel than any mortal enemy. But the dream said otherwise. It told a story she had not fully known. Not betrayal from strangers. No, it was vengeance, and designed with cold intent by those she had once trusted most. Kaelin's steady voice cut through the haze of her thoughts before she even knew he was there, his presence as commanding in the stillness as it had been amidst the chaos of battle. "Velisara," he said softly, the amber glow of his gaze warm and unwavering. "The faces, they aren't strangers this time." Her voice was hoarse, fragile as spun glass. "They're from my village." Kaelin's expression tightened, but did not judge. There was no anger for her vulnerability, only something raw and empathetic that seemed to say, "Asterisk, you are not alone in this." Asterisk. The weight of confession pulling at her chest. They knew what they were doing. My exile was not a mistake. It was meant to be my tomb. He moved closer, folding the distance between them with ease that belied his size. "They feared you," he said quietly, as if speaking the truth aloud, stripped away some of its power. "More than they feared any enemy." She blinked, surprise flashing in her ash-grey eyes. "I'm not a witch, Kaelin, just a girl with some shadows to call her own." Kaelin shook his head slowly, voice low and certain. "No, you are far more than that. They saw what I see, the potential, a power to change everything. You threatened their fragile thrones. Their lies spun like webs around the court. That's why they'd rather kill than confront." Velisara studied him, the lines around his eyes deepening, not with skepticism, but with understanding. For the first time she felt the cold fortress within her soften, not dismantled, but with windows cracked open to light and trust. "My exile was not for nothing," she admitted, voice steadier now with the hardening resolve born of truth. "It was to protect me, or maybe to bury what I could become." Kaelin's hand brushed hers, a small, tentative gesture that grounded her in the turbulent storm of her mind. "We'll unearth their lies together," he promised. "No matter how deep they bury the truth or how many shadows stand in our way." And despite her still fragile trust, something blossomed in the pit of her stomach, a guarded hope, fierce and stubborn. She nodded, squeezing his hand in return, her courage kindling like a slow-burning ember that had found fresh air. Within the shadowed halls of the court, whispered conspiracies brewed like poison in stagnant water. Velisara's nights had grown restless, each dream a flicker of warning, each moment a reminder that enemies were closer than either of them dared to admit. Yet tonight, the thread of her suspicions snapped from subtle fear to undeniable certainty. In the flickering candlelight of the war chamber, an iron-wrought space laden with maps and scattered scrolls, Kaelin stood rigid, amber eyes piercing the gloom as Velisara laid her discovery bare. "They're not just disgruntled," she said, the weight of her voice a blade sharpened by urgency. "The council's own bloodlines plotting to overthrow your reign." Kaelin's brow furrowed, the jagged scar above his brow deepening with the gravity of the news. "How certain are you?" Belisara's fingers traced the edge of the old parchment she held, the evidence painstakingly gathered from slips of conversation, secretive meetings glimpsed in hallways. Coded messages, intercepted, under cloak of night, enough to act. "Before their blade finds your back," his deep breath shook the room, a storm gathering behind those molten gold eyes. "You risk everything by coming to me with this." His voice was low, laden with both caution and respect. "For a long time you held back. Why now?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because survival demands more than endurance. It demands action. Council halls whisper poison, and if we don't uproot the rot, the blood that waters this court won't be mine or yours, it'll be all of ours." There was a shift, subtle but profound. The Alpha King did not frown at her challenge. Instead, he regarded her with a recognition of her growing agency, no longer the exiled pawn, but a force to contend with. Kaelin stepped forward, his arm encircling her waist with protective certainty, their shadows merging beneath the dim torchlight. "Then we face this storm together." Belisara felt the tremor of his beast, a low, guttural growl stirring in his chest, an unspoken warning that their enemies would soon taste the fury waiting just beneath that calm exterior. They bent over the maps, tracing potential allies and foes, each detail a thread in the intricate tapestry of court politics better woven with careful hands. "We unmask them one by one," Kaelin said, his voice a command tempered by trust. "We turn their own shadows against them." Her heart quickened, not just from fear or adrenaline, but from the fierce connection between them. This plotting was not just survival, but a declaration. She would no longer stand silent at the edge of power. She had become the blade sharp enough to slice through deceit. Outside, the night had deepened into a cold breath held by the world. The beast's howl shattered the silence, a primal chorus echoing through stone corridors and desert skies, a warning to those who lurked in darkness that the storm was coming. Belisara stood taller, the flicker of flame alight within her, as storm herself, born of shadows and forged in fire, at last ready to shape the fate of those who had cast her aside. Together, king and exile, beast and flame, they moved through the night with a singular purpose: to reclaim the court, to bind their fractured kingdom, and to defy the darkness that sought to consume them both. The air shifted in the great hall, once a sanctuary of wisdom and alliance, now thick with betrayal, barbed whispers twisting into the clamor of drawn blades and the charged cadence of shattered trust. Kaelin's amber eyes, usually molten with controlled fire, flickered with disbelief and fury as the council's facade cracked open to reveal knives hidden beneath velvet cloaks. Torches guttered against a sudden chill, shadows leaping and twisting in the dim corridors. like venomous serpents striking at their prey. Belisara was at Kaelin's side in an instant, her breath catching on a mix of razor-sharp tension and an instinct born not only of survival but of something far deeper. The council, his trusted advisers, sworn to the court's prosperity, had turned, their faces, masks of loyalty, only moments before, contorted with greed and desperation, eyes glowing with dark designs. The king and his exile, once at opposite ends of the social order, now stood united beneath the weight of treachery. A councillor lunged first. A silent blade flashed through the flickering half-light, aimed directly at Kaelin's throat. Belisara caught the movement, not with her eyes, but with the pulse running electric in her veins. She threw herself forward, the soft hum of her power surging like a living current. The attacker's wrist shattered, a sickening crack echoing through stone as he reeled back, startled. She did not have time to dwell on mercy. Her fingers stretched outward, a gentle glow emanating from her palms, weaving threads of shadow and light into a cage that ensnared another who sought to backstab from the darkness behind. Kaelin, her voice, steady and sharp, tore through the chaos. His eyes locked on hers, brief flickers of concern mingling with something more profound, reliance, a tether stronger than any treaty or title. They moved in tandem, silent and fluid, a duet forged by necessity, his jagged scar, a grim banner, her faint, silver-streaked hair like a comet blazing through night. She felt the familiar surge, the shimmering pulse of power that had once terrified her, now an extension of her will. The shadows around her bent, swirled a cloak that wrapped tighter as more figures from the council struck forth with poisoned intent. Kaelin wielded his sword with the raw force of the beast within, each strike a thunderclap, each block a barrier against fate's cruel hand. Belisara at my side, his voice was rough, the beast's growl entwined, but never overwhelming. There was a trust there that no words could capture, a shared heartbeat in the storm. Her hands shimmered with ethereal light, fingertips bleeding silver flames that licked at the edges of a looming assassin's cloak. She met the other woman's blade, the clash singing through the cold stone as power pushed against will. Her pulse thrummed fiercely, every muscle alive. The faint scar along her jaw burned with fierce clarity, a reminder of every sacrifice, every moment that had led her here. She was no longer the silent shadow, no longer the sacrifice discarded by her village. She was a force magnified by fire and shadow, a storm unleashed. Time fractured into the flicker of combat, the roar of steel against steel, the sharp report of broken defenses, the desperate cries of betrayers cornered. Kaelin fought not just to defend himself, but to protect the fragile alliance blooming between them. He caught her gaze between blows, and in that glance there was the slow unravelling of something neither dared to name aloud, yet connection, tender and terrifying. The betrayal turned the court into a battlefield, painted in blood and smoke. The once hallowed halls echoed festering with the cries of the fallen, the clash of violence beneath vaulted ceilings, wrought with centuries of unyielding tradition. But as each assailant fell, it was not just survival that drove them. It was the forging of a bond, born in fire and straw, men reduced to ash. Belisara could feel the beast's presence, Kaelin's tether to his primal fury looming close, a dark guardian snarling, just beyond the edge of sight. But it was her strength, her unexpected power, that shifted the tide. She moved for Kaelin, pushing back enemies with fierce, radiant pulses until only a handful remained. Through the chaos, their synchronized movements became choreography, a testament to how tightly their fates were entwined. After what seemed like a lifetime compressed into moments, the last attacker fell, groaning on cold stone, the glint of their daggers dulled. The hall stood in shattered silence, save the ragged symphony of gasping breaths and distant winds. Kaelan leaned heavily against the cold ancient wall, his chest heaving as amber eyes searched hers. No longer the king alone in command, but a man stripped of pretense, raw in the aftermath. Belisara. His voice was hoarse, a low rumble barely rising above the thundering blood in her ears. You fought like a tempest. Not just a blade, but the storm itself. She swallowed, fighting the swirl of emotions that threatened to break free: pride, relief, fear, and an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the chaotic heat of battle. I fought alongside you because this. Not anymore. Her words hung fragile, a bridge carefully built above a chasm of scars and mistrust. Kaelan finally straightened, a slow smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as the jagged scar softened beneath the shadow of his grin. I cannot lose you, he confessed, voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for her ears, raw and vulnerable. Not to betrayal, not to fate. Her heart clenched fiercely. And yet, the battle was far from over, not just with enemies, but within the walls that guarded both of them. In the colder sanctuary of his chambers later, the echoes of the night still hummed beneath their skin. Belisara sat beside Kaelan, her hands pressed to his side where the jagged cut bled slow and stubborn. Her touch was steady, even when her heart thundered in protest, a war drum matched only by the soft growl that trembled in the shadows, a whisper of the beast that no longer prowled wild, but lingered, tethered inexplicably to her presence. Kaelan's breath was ragged, his eyes half-closed beneath heavy lids. He said nothing at first, lost in a haze of pain and exhaustion, but his fingers twined with hers, grounding and frail. Why are you here, Belisara? His voice was thick with fatigue and something else, curiosity, perhaps even hope. I'm where I belong, she replied, voice hushed. Fingers mapping the lines of his sinew beneath torn fabric, not just beside the king, but with the man behind the crown. Her thumb brushed over the jagged scar near his brow, a silent acknowledgement of the battles they had both fought in silence. The beast Kaelan's fierce alter ego was unusually subdued, a shadow at the threshold, but not threatening. It curled close like a guardian spirit, reluctant to intrude, its presence blending with Belisara's own burgeoning strength. She could feel that tether, pulsing a subtle shift in the invisible chains that bound them all. It was as if her very existence calmed the tempest within him, drawing the beast's wrath into a quiet ember. Words fell away, and their shared silence spoke volumes. In the flickering candlelight, the walls between king and exile cracked, shards of armor falling away to reveal the fragile, bruised tenderness beneath. You're more than the exile, more than the spark I saw in the war rooms, Kaelan confessed, voice rough with vulnerability. You are the fire I never knew I needed, Belisara's breath. Due ane imba conteling, deep, catching flame. She searched his eyes, the molten gold tempered by raw honesty, and found her own fears dissolve. Then don't lose me, she whispered, voice barely audible but fierce in its trembling certainty. Not now. Not ever. He tightened his grip, a silent vow made without words, a bond forged in shadows but glowing now with a fierce, unbreakable light. The night outside deepened, but inside the storm had quieted, not with defeat, but with the fragile, relentless birth of something fierce enough to defy the darkness yet to come. Together, king and exile, beast and flame, they ventured forward, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as something painfully, beautifully human. Belisara stood before the envoy of her village, under harsh daylight that seemed almost cruel against the cold stone walls of the Shadow Court. The envoy tall men with steely eyes, lips tight with the arrogance of power, had come with a demand wrapped in obligation and old-world entitlement. They wanted her to undo what had been done. They wanted her to bend again, to reclaim the false place of sacrifice they had carved out for her, while reminding her of the change she was supposed to bear. But Velisara was no longer the nameless girl swallowed by shadowed fears, no longer a lamb offered to a merciless fate. She had been forged in crucibles far harsher than any fire her village could light. She was no sacrificial lamb, no pawn, swallowed whole by others' designs. Her eyes, those deep ash-greys flecked with stubborn resolve, met the envoy's cold gazes as clearly as if she were a tempest unbound. "I am not what you sent to die," she said quietly, voice steady but coloured with an unmistakable steel. "I am no longer yours to claim, tethered to your demands or fears." The envoy shifted uneasily, his arrogance flickering for the first time like smoke before a flame. "You misunderstand your position," he said, voice tight. "Your exile was decreed because of what you are. The powers you cloak yourself in, powers we fear, must be controlled or destroyed. You will return to us. You will submit." Velisara's body stiffened, the faint scar on her jawline pulsing almost as if it bore the weight of a silent history. She drew herself taller, drawing on the strength carved out by every betrayal and every whispered threat. But what gave her strength now was not the shadowed past, it was the presence behind her. Kaelin's pack had gathered like a dark tide, standing as one formidable and silent, their amber eyes, fierce and unyielding, softened only for her. At her feet, the beast, the incarnation of Kaelin's own feral, might rested with a possessive stillness. The creature's fur shimmered black as moonless night, muscles coiled in silent defiance. The unmistakable claim was clear. This woman was under their protection, and no ancient cruelty would undo her now. "I will not be broken again," Velisara said, voice rising just enough to break the weighty silence. "I forge my own destiny. Your exile is over. I am chosen, not sacrificed, by my will, by my strength, by the blood that now flows in my veins. You will leave this place knowing that." The envoy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but even he could not deny the truth holding the room like a living thing. The claws of old power were yielding to something new, something unrelenting. Kaelin stepped forward, his voice low, and wrapped in the kind of authority no elder council could match. "She stands as equal in my court, equal in my pact. Her fate is no longer yours to dictate." The words, a proclamation both to the envoy and to the court itself, rippled through the space, shattering more than just the silence. They ripped apart shadows of past cruelty and breathed life into a future carved by choice, not chains. Velisara's heart thundered in her chest, not a wild, terrified pulse, but the rhythmic beat of defiance and newfound sovereignty. With every glance she cast at Kaelin's pack, every flicker of the beast's gleaming eyes at her feet, she could feel the invisible barriers crumbling. She was no longer a piece on their board, no longer a secret whispered behind closed doors. "I will remember this day," she said softly, but with unwavering conviction, "not as a wound, but as the moment I took back my own story." As the village envoy retreated, defeated by the fiercest weapon of all, unyielding will Velisara turned back into the shadowed embrace of the court. The weight of the past was still heavy, but it no longer suffocated her. In its place was a new rhythm, one born not of fear but of fire. Asterisk. The whispers had broken free like wildfire soon after the confrontation. Rumours spread on the wind, threading their way through the twisting alleys of the city, seeping into taverns, council chambers, and guarded homes. They spoke of Velisara's powers, wild and untamed, devastating and dangerous, ablaze with a ferocity the realm had not seen in generations. "Did you hear? They say she can raise entire forests with a single wave of her hand," an old woman murmured to the barkeep, eyes wide with a blend of fear and fascination. "They say the earth itself shudders when she speaks," a soldier confided in a hushed tone at the market, glancing nervously over his shoulder. It was more than rumor, it was truth, twisted through fear and awe, growing with every telling. Kaelin knew the storm brewing was not just about politics or power, it was about survival. Felisara's strength made her a beacon and a target. Every shadow in this kingdom now seemed to bend toward her, some with envy, others with malice. Yet he did not flinch. Instead, he tightened his guard around her, his presence as unyielding as the ancient stones they both now called home. At night, when the court settled and the city's breath slowed to ghostly whispers, Kaelin sought Felisara. Together, they found solace atop the city's ancient walls, where the moon hung like a silent sentinel and the world stretched out, dark, endless, uncertain. Under that pale light, the slow burn of their fragile trust deepened. Words came less easily than the quiet moments shared, the brushing of fingers against stone, the steady presence of warmth beside chill night air. Felisara felt the weight of the rumors pressing in, but here, in this liminal space between the sky and the city, she knew she was not alone. "I hear them talking," she said one night, voice soft with a mixture of fear and defiance. "They fear what I might become. But it feels like we walk a knife's edge. What if I slip? What if I lose myself in this power?" Kaelin's amber eyes, glowing with the calm certainty of the beast and the man, met hers. He reached out, thumb brushing a stray silver thread from her hair. "You won't lose yourself, not as long as I'm here, and not as long as you hold on to your fire. That power isn't a curse, it's part of who you are. A part I would choose every time." Felisara's breath caught. There was no comforting lie there, only a fierce promise carved in the unyielding night. They sat close, the quiet around them throbbing with something stronger than words, a connection forged not just by trust, but the raw understanding of two broken souls learning to breathe in unison. Her fingers found his, tentative at first, then certain. "You're my anchor," she admitted, voice almost too small to hear beyond the gentle wind. "My fiercest defender." Kaelin's lips curled into a rare soft smile, the jagged scar across his brow almost seeming to heal in the moonlight. "We're something no shadow can swallow." They lingered, wrapped in the silent oath beneath stars that had seen empires rise and crumble, beneath a sky that held forever in its watchful embrace. The world below was spinning faster, growing darker with every whispered fear and silent threat. But here, above it all, two hearts, one beast, one flame, burned steady. The bond between them was still fragile, yes, new, and trembling like the first pulse of dawn in a long, cruel night. But it was fierce, real, alive. Felisara let the night's cool breath fill her lungs, the ancient stones beneath her grounding her. The fears would come, the chaos, the pain, but she was no longer the girl from the edge of oblivion. She was chosen, she was fire, and beside the Alpha King, she would be unbreakable. The night deepened around them, folding Felisara and Kaelin in its chill embrace, a silent witness to the secrets long buried beneath layers of fear and shadow. Felisara's fingers lingered in Kaelin's warm grasp, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the surge of something relentless and undeniable that had been simmering just beneath her skin, waiting for the moment to break free. She drew a slow breath, the weight of the truth pressing heavy and sacred in her chest, then met his molten amber eyes with an intensity born of years of quiet endurance and fractured hope. "There's something I need to tell you," she murmured, voice trembling only with the rawness of vulnerability. "Something that has been part of me longer than I even knew." Her gaze dipped, tracing the scar along her jawline, as if it was a roadmap to an identity finally stepping into the light. "I come from a bloodline, one that's been intertwined with your pack's prophecy for generations. The one you've kept close, spoken of only in whispers beneath the moon." Kaelin's brow furrowed as he absorbed her words, the flicker of hunter and king sharpening in his eyes, but it was the stillness of his beast beneath the surface that betrayed the depth of the revelation. The rumble of the beast's presence, usually a dormant storm, shifted and gathered like a tempest stirring to life. "My tribe's legends speak of the flame-bearer, the woman who rises from the ashes of exile, to stand not beside the alphabet as his equal, his mate," Felisara continued, voice steady now with the fire of truth no longer hidden. "They warned of betrayal, a severance meant to silence her before the bond could seal. And I was that exile, the sacrifice meant to sever the prophecy's roots." Her eyes searched his, raw with the pain of rejection, but underneath it all, a fierce, unyielding resolve. "But I'm here. I wasn't given to the shadows to die. I was meant to return, to reclaim, to unite." Kaelin's body tensed, the scarred warrior unraveling at the edges, as if decades of battle-hardened defenses were peeling away to reveal something softer, something profoundly eager. His voice came low and rough as a half-forgotten promise. "You are the flame of that, I have no doubt. The pieces I never understood, the exile, the betrayal, the silence from my own pack, they all fall into place with you." Beneath the polished calm of his gaze, the beast stirred restlessly, shedding the rust of patience accumulated over years. Its presence surged a wild, powerful force, acknowledging what Kaelin had only dared to hope for, a mate long awaited, the missing fire to tame the storm. The ground seemed to hum as if the ancient stones beneath them pulsed in acknowledgement, and in that moment the fracture between king and exile dissolved to ash in the wind. Felisara felt it, power and purpose converging in her veins, the pulse of the past weaving with the now. She was no longer alone in this labyrinth of shadow and light. They were bound, two sparks converging into an inferno none could extinguish. It was not just a union of bodies or souls, it was a binding of fates long foretold. The calm before the storm shattered suddenly, as a howl ripped through the night, sharp, ragged, a herald of violence inching closer. The enemy forces had emerged from the depths, drawn by the scent of power and the scent of lingering vulnerability. They came with fire and steel, a tide that sought to drown the Shadow Court once and for all. Kaelin's grip on Felisara tightened, the beast's roar swelling from within, a growl deep and primal that echoed against the ancient stone walls. "They want to break us," he said, voice fierce as his amber eyes blazed brighter, "but they don't know the strength of a flame paired with a beast." Felisara rose beside him, her body humming with electricity. A tempest harnessed at last. The years of silent endurance, the whispered fears, the stolen moments of doubt, everything coalesced into raw power pooling beneath her skin. Her hands sparked with an ethereal silver light, energy bending to her will as her ash-grey eyes flared with fierce cobalt fire. "We fight as one," she declared, voice resolute and ringing with the authority that had always belonged to her. "They will find no weakness here." Together they met the onslaught. Kaelin led the charge, his beast erupting like a thunderclap across the battlefield, fury incarnate. Claws and teeth rended the shadow, while his golden eyes held the unyielding command of the Alpha King. Beside him, Felisara moved like a warrior born anew, her powers cracking open the darkness. With every gesture, She wove magic into the clash of steel, bending light and shadow to carve space for them in the madness. The enemy faltered time and again against the avalanche of their combined strength. The slow burn of their bond ignited now into roaring flames, fierce and wild. Their attacks were not just synchronized, they were soul sound, heartbeat, breath in sync, like the crescendo of a tempest-made flesh. Pain laced the air with iron and smoke, but beneath it, a fierce, undeniable truth throbbed through Velisara's veins. She belonged here beside Kaelin, not as a shadow haunting his past, but as the blazing force in his future. Time blurred amid the fray. She heard Kaelin's voice, steady and powerful, calling her name over the din. She swung her hands wide and released a surge of energy that flared like wildfire, knocking back foes who dared close in. The beast's roars were pounding war drums in her ears, a symphony of strength, rage and protection that carried her through every lash and stumble. Finally, as dawn crept hesitant fingers of light into the horizon, the enemy faltered and fled, broken and scattered beneath the united force of the Alpha King and his firebearer. The Shadow Court, battered but unbowed, breathed a collective sigh. Silence settled, not the silence of defeat, but of victory carved by blood, flame, and unbreakable will. Belisara sank to her knees, breath-ragged but heart-soaring, and Kaelin came beside her, his hand collar steady, unshakable, finding hers. They looked at one another through the residue of battle, their shared scars and dirt-smeared faces, testament to the storm they had survived united. In that quiet aftermath, the pack gathered, eyes wide, but no longer wary. Where once there had been suspicion and exile, there was now respect, reverence, a recognition of a queen risen not from bloodlines or birthright alone, but from the fire of survival and the courage of love forged in shadow. The elders stepped forward, their voices heavy with unspoken history, acknowledging the prophecy fulfilled in Velisara's return. The murmurs of doubt dissolved like mist, replaced by a steady chorus. She was chosen, not cast out. She was theirs now, their equal, their anchor. Her place was by Kaelin's side, as queen, not beneath, but beside. Kaelin drew her gently to her feet, their hands entwined, like the unbreakable chains of fate and salvation. The beast curled at their feet, no longer restless but calm, a sentient sentinel in the aftermath of victory. The great hall, once steeped in shadow and fear, now seemed to breathe with the possibility of dawn. Velisara looked over at Kaelin, the fire still burning bright in his eyes, the jagged scar on his brow, a reminder of battles fought and endured. Then, slowly, she lifted her own hand to trace the line of that scar, softly, reverently, as if marking the birth of new beginnings upon the maps of their shared skin. Together, they moved toward the highest tower of the Shadow Court, where the world stretched vast and unknowable below. The air was crisp with promise, the first chords of morning unfurling across the horizon as city lights twinkled like distant stars beneath them. They stood side by side, fingers laced,